There's a quiet habit that many people never notice forming in their lives, partly because it does not arrive dramatically and partly because it rarely announces itself as something dangerous. It begins subtly, often disguised as maturity, responsibility, patience, or resilience. At first, it feels reasonable. You tell yourself that you are tired because life is demanding, disconnected because adulthood is busy, unhappy because difficult seasons happen to everyone. You reassure yourself that things will improve once work becomes less stressful, once the pressure eases, once there is more money, more certainty, more time, more emotional energy. Yet something strange often happens during this waiting. The discomfort that once felt temporary slowly becomes familiar, and familiarity has a way of changing what people are willing to tolerate. Many people do not realize how much suffering they have adapted to until something finally breaks. It may be a relationship that quietly stopped feeling safe long ago, an exhaustion that became so constant it no longer seemed unusual, or a version of life that looked functional from the outside, but quietly hollow from within. What makes this habit difficult to recognize is that it rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. Most people are not consciously deciding to ignore themselves. They are simply continuing, adjusting, adapting, convincing themselves that discomfort is normal because discomfort has become predictable. Human beings are remarkably adaptable, and under many circumstances, adaptation is one of our greatest strengths. It allows people to survive grief, recover after disappointment, endure uncertainty, and continue functioning through painful chapters of life. The problem is not adaptation itself. The problem begins when people unknowingly adapt to forms of suffering that were never meant to become permanent. Emotional exhaustion becomes routine. Loneliness becomes familiar. Quiet unhappiness begins to feel ordinary. What once felt alarming eventually becomes background noise. This often explains why people remain in situations that no longer feel emotionally healthy long after they have privately acknowledged something feels wrong. Rarely does someone wake up one morning and consciously decide, "I will stay unhappy." More often, the process unfolds through smaller negotiations with discomfort. You tell yourself the relationship is only difficult because every relationship has problems. You assume the constant heaviness at work is temporary because everyone feels stressed. You convince yourself that emotional distance from your own life is simply adulthood becoming more serious. Little by little, your expectations quietly rearrange themselves around survival rather than fulfillment. The strange thing about emotional discomfort is that it rarely asks for permission before becoming familiar. At first, unhappiness feels sharp. You notice it immediately. A difficult environment unsettles you. Emotional neglect feels painful. Exhaustion feels alarming. Yet repetition changes perception. What once stood out eventually begins to blend into ordinary experience. People stop asking whether something feels healthy and instead begin asking whether they can manage it. Unfortunately, manageability often disguises itself as acceptance. There are countless adults quietly functioning this way without fully realizing it. They go to work, answer messages, complete responsibilities, maintain appearances, and continue meeting expectations while carrying an emotional fatigue they stopped questioning years ago. Sometimes it appears in small moments that feel strangely difficult to explain. Sitting in the car for a few extra minutes before entering the house, because silence feels easier than interaction. Feeling exhausted after ordinary conversations without understanding why. Lying awake replaying something someone said days ago because it touched an insecurity that never fully healed. Feeling emotionally distant from people they genuinely care about while quietly wondering when life started feeling so emotionally muted. People often imagine emotional pain as something obvious, but much of adult suffering is quiet. It rarely looks dramatic enough to demand immediate attention. Instead, it disguises itself as irritability, overthinking, procrastination, emotional numbness, indecision, or exhaustion that no amount of sleep seems to resolve. Sometimes pain hides behind productivity itself. A person becomes so busy maintaining responsibilities that they stop noticing how emotionally disconnected they feel from their own life. This is partly why awareness tends to arrive late. Pain that develops gradually rarely feels urgent. Human beings are much more responsive to sudden discomfort than slow deterioration. A broken bone demands attention immediately. Emotional erosion, however, moves differently. It often unfolds through months or years of compromise, avoidance, and emotional postponement. You learn to silence certain thoughts because they feel inconvenient. You delay difficult conversations because conflict feels uncomfortable. You remain in familiar dissatisfaction because uncertainty feels frightening. Fear has a habit of disguising itself as logic. People rarely say, "I am afraid to change." Instead, fear becomes practical reasoning. It sounds responsible. You tell yourself that now is not the right time, that things are complicated, that perhaps you are overthinking, that maybe you expect too much. Sometimes people become so skilled at rationalizing emotional discomfort that they lose the ability to recognize when fear is quietly shaping their decisions. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly explaining away your own unhappiness. It happens when you repeatedly negotiate with realities that no longer feel emotionally sustainable. You know something feels wrong, but instead of confronting it directly, you learn to soften the truth. You minimize your loneliness because others seem lonelier. You dismiss burnout because everyone seems overwhelmed. You silence disappointment because gratitude feels more acceptable than honesty. Yet emotional honesty is difficult precisely because people fear what it might require of them. Acknowledging unhappiness often creates uncomfortable questions. If this no longer feels healthy, what changes must happen? If this relationship is slowly diminishing me, what truth have I avoided? If I no longer recognize myself, when did I begin disappearing? These questions feel destabilizing, which is why many people unconsciously postpone them until life becomes unbearable enough that avoidance no longer works. Sometimes awareness arrives dramatically, a moment of emotional collapse during an ordinary day, crying unexpectedly after someone asks a simple question, feeling strangely empty after achieving something that was supposed to matter, realizing during a quiet evening that despite functioning well, life no longer feels emotionally alive. At other times, awareness arrives through accumulation, a growing heaviness that becomes impossible to ignore, a repeated sense that something feels off, a quiet understanding that surviving and living are not always the same thing. Many people wait until suffering becomes intolerable before asking deeper questions, because discomfort alone rarely feels sufficient to justify change. Human beings tend to overvalue familiarity, even when familiarity is painful. The known discomfort often feels safer than the unknown possibility. A disappointing relationship feels less frightening than loneliness. Emotional exhaustion feels more manageable than uncertainty. Staying stuck often feels psychologically safer than beginning again. Yet there's an emotional cost to repeatedly abandoning discomfort truths within yourself. Each time people ignore emotional signals, something subtle happens. They become slightly more disconnected from their own instincts. They stop trusting what they feel. They convince themselves they are simply dramatic, impatient, sensitive, unrealistic, or ungrateful. Over time, this quiet self-dismissal becomes habitual. The voice inside that once noticed discomfort grows quieter, not because it disappeared, but because it learned it would not be listened to. Perhaps this explains why some people struggle to understand what they truly want after years of emotional compromise. They have spent so much time adjusting to expectations, responsibilities, disappointments, and emotional survival that their own inner voice feels unfamiliar. Sometimes people confuse numbness for peace, simply because chaos has finally stopped. Sometimes they mistake emotional distance for maturity, because vulnerability became exhausting. Sometimes they believe they no longer care when, in reality, they have simply become tired of hoping. Overthinking often thrives inside this emotional uncertainty. When people avoid uncomfortable truths, the mind compensates by endlessly revisiting possibilities. Conversations replay at night. Decisions become impossible. Regret and anticipation begin competing for attention. Many people believe overthinking comes from caring too much, but often it emerges because clarity has been postponed for too long. The mind continues circling unresolved emotions because something important remains emotionally unfinished. There's also something deeply human about waiting. People wait to heal because healing requires admitting something hurt more deeply than they wanted to believe. They wait to leave because endings carry grief. They wait to begin because uncertainty feels frightening. They wait to rest because exhaustion feels productive. Sometimes people delay emotional honesty because they fear disappointing others more than disappointing themselves. And yet, despite how common this pattern is, awareness eventually begins asking questions that are difficult to silence forever. Why have I accepted this for so long? Why do I feel emotionally distant even when everything appears fine? Why does ordinary life feel heavier than it used to? These questions rarely appear because someone has failed. Often, they appear because something wise inside the human mind finally grows too tired to continue pretending. Perhaps one of the quieter tragedies of adulthood is how easily people become accustomed to emotional deprivation without realizing it. Not dramatic suffering, but the smaller forms that slowly diminish aliveness. Conversations that no longer feel meaningful. Relationships where honesty feels unsafe. Days that feel endlessly repetitive. Ambitions pursued without emotional connection. A life that works on paper while quietly exhausting the person living it. Still, awareness itself changes something. Not immediately, not perfectly, and not always dramatically, but quietly. Once people begin recognizing the difference between surviving and living, pretending becomes harder. Familiar pain no longer feels invisible. Emotional avoidance becomes easier to notice. The habits that once felt automatic begin revealing themselves. Sometimes healing begins not with courage, but with honesty. A quiet admission that something no longer feels right. An acknowledgement that exhaustion has become too familiar. A realization that loneliness exists even in crowded rooms. A willingness to stop explaining away disappointment and instead become curious about what it has been trying to reveal. Perhaps this is the uncomfortable truth hidden beneath so much delayed healing. People often wait until life hurts because pain finally interrupts adaptation. It becomes loud enough to challenge the stories they have been telling themselves. Loud enough to expose what exhaustion disguised. Loud enough to remind them that functioning is not always flourishing, and endurance is not always well-being. Yet there is something quietly hopeful in this realization as well. Awareness may arrive late, but late is not the same as never. Human beings are often slower to understand themselves than they expect. Sometimes it takes years to recognize fear hiding beneath logic. Years to notice loneliness disguised as independence. Years to understand that exhaustion is not always proof of hard work, but sometimes evidence of emotional neglect. And perhaps the real shift begins when people stop asking, "How much longer can I tolerate this?" and begin asking something gentler but more honest. What have I been trying not to feel? Because beneath many forms of emotional waiting lies an avoided truth quietly asking for attention. Not punishment, not judgment, only recognition. Maybe that is why awareness feels strangely emotional when it finally arrives. Not because people suddenly become weak, but because they realize how long they have been carrying something silently. They begin understanding that much of human suffering is not created by dramatic collapse, but by small compromises repeated for too long. Quiet disappointments left unnamed. Emotional fatigue dismissed as normal. Familiar unhappiness accepted because familiarity feels safer than change. And perhaps understanding this changes something important. Not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because people begin seeing themselves more clearly. They recognize the quiet ways they adapted, protected themselves, postponed difficult truths, and survived in the only ways they knew how. There is something deeply human in that realization. Not failure, not weakness, only the complicated reality of being a person trying to live while also learning how to understand oneself. Because sometimes the question is not why we waited until it hurt. Sometimes the more honest question is why it felt necessary to hurt before we finally listened.